February 1984. NBC Studios, New York City, 3 days before the Grammy Awards. James Brown walked into that studio the way he always walked into every room, like the room had been waiting for him. 50 years old, 3 decades of uninterrupted dominance, a catalog that had invented entire genres and influenced everything that followed. He sat down across from host David Mercer, straightened his jacket, and settled into the chair with the calm of a man who has never once, not for a single moment, doubted that he belongs exactly where he is. The show was called American Sound Tonight, a weekly music conversation program that NBC had been running for 4 years. Serious guests, serious talk. The kind of television where your reputation either grows under the studio lights or quietly cracks. James Brown was not the kind of man whose reputation cracked anywhere. He was there to talk about the state of American music, which meant in the winter of 1984 that Thriller was eventually going to come up. It had been 14 months since the album dropped. It had sold 30 million copies. Michael Jackson was nominated for 8 Grammy Awards, the most of any artist that year, and the whole country was in the middle of a heated argument about what that actually meant. Whether it was a cultural moment or just a commercial one, whether Michael Jackson was a musician or a spectacle. James Brown had thoughts about that distinction. He had been sharpening those thoughts for months. Thriller, he said when Mercer finally brought it up. He let the word sit in the air for just a beat. Then he laughed. Not cruel, not theatrical. More like the laugh of someone who has been asked a question with an obvious answer and finds the asking slightly amusing. Beautiful costume party. The boy can dance, I'll give him that. Always could. But soul? The real thing. The thing that comes from somewhere inside a person that you can't manufacture, can't rehearse, can't design in a costume department? He shook his head slowly. I put that kid on stages when he was barely this tall. He raised his hand about 4 feet from the floor. I introduced him to the world. And now look, one glove, a hat, zombies in a music video. That's entertainment, David. That's showbiz. But don't call it music. Music comes from the chest. It doesn't come out of a costume bag. The studio audience laughed with him. Of course they did. This was James Brown, the godfather of soul. When he spoke with that kind of certainty, rooms agreed. It was almost a reflex. Mercer smiled, nodded, and began to shift his notes toward the next topic. And then he stopped. James, he said carefully, I have something here I'd like to read, if that's all right. Michael Jackson gave an interview to Rolling Stone last month. He talked about you. James Brown leaned back in his chair, relaxed, legs crossed, completely at ease. Go ahead. Mercer looked down at the page. James Brown invented a language inside music. I learned to speak that language. Without him, I simply don't exist. And I mean that not as flattery, but as music history. Every step I take on stage, every note I reach for, every breath I take before a song, all of it passed through him first. I grew up listening to him. I became a musician by watching him. There is no greater respect I carry anywhere in my life than the respect I have for James Brown. The studio went quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for a punchline. Something heavier, something that settled into the room and stayed there. Mercer hadn't finished. And then there's this part, he said, his voice dropping just slightly. I think about this sometimes. The man who broke every rule music had, who looked at every wall and walked straight through it, who showed the whole world that the boundaries aren't real, that man pauses when he sees someone else walk through a wall. That's the part I keep coming back to, because the courage to do what I do. He's the one who gave it to me. Mercer placed the paper on the desk. He didn't say anything, because there was nothing to add. James Brown's hands rested on the armrests of his chair, completely still. 30 seconds ago, he had been laughing, and the room had been laughing with him. Now the audience was silent. The crew was silent. Mercer sat with his hands folded and let the silence do what silence does when it's carrying something true. Nobody was angry. The mood hadn't turned hostile. What had happened was quieter than that and more precise. Everyone in that studio had understood the same thing at the same moment. Michael Jackson had not fought back. He hadn't defended Thriller. He hadn't called James Brown jealous or outdated or wrong. He had done something that required far more control and far more nerve than any of that. He had looked at the man who laughed at him, acknowledged everything that man had given him, genuinely, specifically, without any performance of gratitude, and then named in one calm and steady sentence exactly what that man had forgotten about himself. You taught me that the walls aren't real. So what are you building around me? That was the charge. And it landed the way only true things land. Cleanly, without noise, directly into the center of the room. James Brown had been performing for 30 years by that point. He had survived radio blacklists, industry executives who tried to shelf him, rivals who came for his crown, entire decades that tried to leave him behind. He had gotten through all of it on force of will and the absolute conviction that he was right about what he was doing. He knew how to handle attacks. You absorbed them, you smiled, you reminded the room of your catalog. He had not been prepared for a 25-year-old from Gary, Indiana, to sit down in a Rolling Stone interview and deliver the most accurate and most devastating compliment he had ever received in his life. Because here was the thing. Michael hadn't just praised him, he had studied him. The reference wasn't vague, it was specific. Every step, every note, every breath. That wasn't the language of someone who was performing admiration. That was the language of someone who had actually listened, actually learned, actually carried the work forward. And that specificity was what made the second part of the quote impossible to dismiss. You couldn't wave it off as a young artist being defensive. The man had done his homework, and the homework said, the Godfather of Soul had somehow stopped being curious. Mercer eventually moved the conversation forward, the way hosts do. The show continued. James Brown recovered with the speed of a man who had been performing composure his entire career. Quickly, smoothly, with his surface completely intact. The rest of his appearance was polished, funny, magnetic, present. He was James Brown. But the room didn't return to where it had been before that page was read. That particular temperature doesn't come back once it changes. Several people who were in that studio described the same moment years later, independently of each other. The instant Mercer set the paper on the desk, the way James Brown's hands stayed exactly where they were on the armrest without moving, the quality of the silence, not uncomfortable, but weighted, like everyone was sitting with something they'd just been handed and hadn't figured out yet what to do with. A camera operator who worked that show for 3 seasons said he had never felt a studio shift like that. It wasn't tension, he said. It was more like recognition. Like everyone realized at the same time that the person who'd been laughed at was actually the one who understood what was happening in that room. 3 days later, Michael Jackson won 8 Grammy Awards, all 8 of his nominations, the most won by any artist in a single night in the history of the ceremony at that point. He stood at that podium 8 separate times over the course of the evening. He was 25 years old and he thanked his family and God in Quincy Jones, and he was gracious every single time. A reporter found James Brown leaving an event that same night and asked him what he thought about Michael's evening. James Brown kept walking for 2 steps. Then he answered. He earned it. 2 words, but from James Brown, in February 1984, 2 words was the size of a cathedral. Time does things to rivalries that arguments never can. It creates distance. It lets both people see past what was personal and into what was actually true. By 1988, the contempt was gone from how James Brown talked about Michael in interviews, not replaced by warmth exactly, not yet, but by something more complicated and more honest than contempt. In a conversation with Ebony magazine that year, he said it plainly. Michael Jackson took things from me. He did. Moves, energy, ideas. He took them and he ran with them. But where he took them, I couldn't have gone there. That's not better than me. That's just different from me. And different isn't a crime. From James Brown, that was practically a declaration of peace. The real moment came in June 2003, the BET Awards in Los Angeles. Michael was being honored. James Brown was presenting. He walked to the podium, looked out at the audience, found Michael in the front row, and stopped. He stood there for a moment without speaking, and then, Without a script, into the microphone, he said, "This man is my son. In music, this is my son." Michael stood up from his seat and walked to the stage, and they held each other while the entire room rose to its feet. Whatever had been unresolved since February 1984, whatever the NBC studio had left hanging between those two men for 19 years ended right there. Not with an explanation, not with an apology, with something older and truer than either of those things. James Brown died on Christmas morning, 2006. He was 73 years old. Michael flew to Augusta, Georgia for the funeral. He didn't give a statement at the airport. He didn't speak to the press walking into the church. He sat through the service. He left the same way he came in, or quietly. One camera caught him for a fraction of a second as he walked out. A reporter managed to push close enough to ask one question. "Michael, what do you want people to know about James Brown?" Michael stopped walking. He looked at the reporter. He took one breath. "The light went out," he said. Then he was in the car and gone. He never said anything more about it publicly. He didn't need to. 3 words from a man who had spent his whole life searching for the right word at the right moment was its own complete eulogy. Simple, final, and entirely true. That NBC studio night from February 1984 never became the kind of clip that gets endlessly replayed. The recording is incomplete. The full audio survives only in fragments. But the people who were in that room remember it with the specific, unblurring clarity that attaches to moments when something real happens inside a space that was built entirely for performance. James Brown laughed at Thriller on live television, and Michael Jackson, in a magazine interview given weeks before that, laughter echoed through a studio, had already placed the only answer that was ever going to matter. Not a fight, not a defense, not a single raised voice. Just the truth stated quietly, aimed at exactly the right place, from exactly the right distance. Some responses don't need a room to land in. They find their room on their own. Have you ever had someone dismiss what you built? Someone you actually looked up to? Someone whose opinion felt like it should matter more than anyone else's, and had to decide whether to fight back or simply let the truth do its work? Tell me in the comments, because that's the exact decision Michael made in January 1984, sitting across from a Rolling Stone journalist, choosing his words very carefully, and it turned out to be the only choice that lasted.